Welcome to a Camp Blanding Museum history video. I'm Dr. George Cressman, and I serve as the museum's historian. Today I'm going to talk about a transition that happened in the summer of 1943. And that transition moved Camp Blanding from training units to training individuals. Camp Blanding became an IRTC, an Infantry Replacement Training Center, in the summer of 1943. Camp Blanding's mission was initially unit training, and in fact, just over 150 units trained at Camp Blanding during World War II. But in the summer of 1943, most units were either in a combat theater or on their way to a combat theater. And so now the issue became training replacements for casualties in the combat theaters. So in the summer of 1943, Camp Blanding was converted from a unit training facility to an individual training facility. And Camp Blanding became an infantry replacement training center. There were 14 IRTCs in the United States. Of those 14, Camp Blanding was the second largest in terms of area. Camp Blanding at that point had almost 153,000 acres. Camp Blanding was also the second largest in terms of training capacity. Camp Blanding had a training capacity at that point of almost 61,000. Infantry divisions had a series of functions. Of course, combat infantrymen was the most important. And in World War II, an infantry division had 3 infantry regiments. Infantry was the starting point. And here you see some of the courses that infantrymen trained on here at Camp Blanding. With the machine gun firing overhead, combat infantrymen crawling underneath the barbed wire. You see the end of that infiltration course as in the right-hand photo. Combat infantrymen at all IRTCs were trained to use all of the light infantry weapons. The rifles, M1 Garand or the M1 carbine, the Browning automatic rifle or the BAR, submachine guns, the Thompson sub and the grease gun, machine guns themselves, both the light and heavy, as well as the use of grenades and mortars. Combat infantrymen became proficient in the use of all of those weapons. But there were also artillery battalions, and you see here men loading a artillery piece training for service in the cannon companies, as they were called in the World War II infantry division. Signal was most important. You see a infantryman stringing cable, stringing wire for communication, and then perhaps one of the more desirable jobs, a foxhole with a teletype machine on the ledge in the foxhole itself, and the soldier operating it. Engineers were critical. They were called pioneers. Not pioneers as we think of exploring the West in the United States, but a term that actually comes from German engineers, pioneers. Pioneers or engineers in an infantry division were trained in all of the lighter engineer tasks, light construction, demolition, building roadblocks, laying landmines. One of the World War II combat engineers that I interviewed at one point said it was the best job in the Army You got to build things and then you got to blow them up. Drivers were critical. An average infantry division had over 10,000 vehicles of all sizes and sorts. So drivers were needed for trucks, for cars, for jeeps, for all of the vehicles that would normally accompany an infantry division. Drivers were trained to operate specific vehicles, and they were licensed for those vehicles. The drivers were also trained for light mechanical work to make sure that their vehicles continued to be able to function. So things like changing tires, changing oil, making sure that all of the fittings were properly greased. These were all chores that were taught, tasks that were taught to drivers. The Medical Corps trained medics that deployed with the infantry division, and that training happened through the station hospitals here. So here in these photos you see medics training, doing practice work on a field exercise. The IRTC at Camp Landing had a number of combat courses. Here in this slide you see some photos of the Japanese airfield, the mock Japanese airfield that was built at Camp Landing. It was located over on what's called today North Post. And here you see both the operating area of that airfield, as well as the mock-up of a Japanese Zero on the airfield itself. In addition to the Japanese airfield, there was a jungle course. In this next slide, you see two photographs of that jungle course. The Japanese village that was located on the North Post, as well as the Japanese airfield and the jungle course, became much more important for the IRTC in late 1944 and 1945 as the European War began to wind down. But initially, of course, we were training soldiers for the European and Mediterranean theaters. So Camp Landing on North Post had a mock German village. And you see soldiers here assaulting that mock German village. Performing assaults was, of course, the critical part of infantry training. And these assaults were practiced regularly here at the IRTC. In the left-hand photo, you see men moving across a cratered field. Craters were created by buried explosive, not by bombs or artillery shells, but across a cratered field. And in the lower right-hand corner, you see a photograph of what the caption on the photograph was labeled "Assault from the Sea." And it's actually soldiers coming off of Kingsley Lake and going up the sand dune area that you can still find on the post today. Range time was crucially important. Soldiers practiced on all of their weapons on ranges located on what today is called North Post. So all of the weapons that soldiers would be using, bazookas, grenades, all were practiced on the North Post. Bayonet training, a traditional part of infantry training, was done at Camp Landing on a series of ranges on the South Post. Bayonet training has been a staple of infantry training for many years, remains so today. There was great fear that there would be a poison gas attack, particularly in the European theater during World War II. So soldiers were trained to properly fit and wear a gas mask. There were a series of what were called gas chambers at the post. These were not used for punishment. They were used for training soldiers on how to put on a gas mask. And for those of you who've undergone basic infantry training, you'll recall the room full of tear gas. This is essentially what was going on for trainees here in the IRTC. There was also a river training effort put in place here at Camp Blanding. And here you see a group of Camp Blanding soldiers paddling assault boats. We know this photograph was taken at Camp Blanding, but we have yet to identify exactly where it was taken. River crossings were a major portion of the war in the European theater, not to as great extent in the Pacific theater, but an essential element of training for combat theaters. Field work was an essential part of what the soldiers did. Bivouacs became an important part of the training process, and in late 1944, the IRTC training period was extended by 3 weeks to allow a long field training bivouac exercise. The soldiers went out for almost 16 days and spent that time in the field in bivouacs. Here you see this photo of an inspection in a bivouac. Yes, inspections happen not just on the post itself, but in training also. Well, thank you for spending this time with us today. We hope you've enjoyed learning something about the Camp Blanding as an infantry replacement training center. We'd like to strongly invite you to come out and visit us. We're open every day from noon to 4, and we'd love to see you. For all of Camp Blanding's museum staff and volunteers, this is Dr. George Cressman signing off. But there were also artillery regiments. 4 of them are in the, there's a mistake on that slide. It should say artillery battalions.